A Mississippi fireman is shot to death in his own home.
They discovered a deceased male in the bathroom floor.
The only people that were at the residence were the victim and the two suspects.
As the investigation unfolds, detectives must assess conflicting narratives.
She said she shot him.
Okay, but she didn't tell you what led up to that.
It was suspected that it could have been a domestic type situation.
I saw there's a shelf with a knife that seemed to be really out of place, and wires were coming out of the ceiling.
When a missing clue is discovered, the truth behind the shooting starts to surface.
Would your fingerprints be on there?
And maybe.
He wanted somebody that could work together and they'd be happy, but that's not what he got.
There was search results for how to get away with murder.
I've never had a defendant scare me. She scares me.
I said, she's a tiger, and you gonna be the prey.
November 12th, 2019. It's 7:30 a.m. in Olive Branch, Mississippi, when the sheriff's office receives a cryptic 911 call.
Somebody's been shot. Can you please get an officer?
Who shot? Do you know?
No.
You don't know what happened?
I just got home. Send somebody, please.
The caller did not give us their name or provide any other additional information. They're upset, they're frantic, they just want to report the call, and they don't give a lot of detail.
First responders race to the address, a sprawling home in an upscale neighborhood.
The first officers who arrived at the scene talked to a young male named Joshua. He indicates that he is the person that called 911 and said someone was shot at this particular residence.
Joshua lived with his mother, Felicia Barden, and in the home with Willie Barden.
I got there, didn't know exactly what was going on. My mom's very frantic, walking room to room, room to room. I had the simple question of where is Willie? And then honestly, it was all adrenaline filled. So whatever I told the police is just whatever I know that happened. You know what I'm saying? I'm like, dead body, blood, gun, shot. It was horrible.
His first thing out of his mouth was, my mom shot Willie in self-defense. He's crying a little bit. They get him secured. They get him in the back of a patrol car. They make entry into the house. And that's where they find Felicia Barden.
She was crying, she was acting frantic, and she did have a gash on her forehead that was bleeding. The officers asked if she's okay. She said she didn't know.
I have no idea what happened. There was a blood on her face, and I was so out of it myself, I didn't really notice, you know what I'm saying, all the injuries.
They bring her out and secure her in the back of a patrol car. Then they clear the house, and that's where they discovered a deceased male in the bathroom floor.
The victim was identified as Willie Barden, the husband of Felicia Barden.
The body was turned over and it was determined that he had suffered a gunshot wound to the chest.
At this point, it looked like a domestic violence situation. We have someone who was murdered and a female with injuries. We don't know anything else.
Willie James Barden was born on December 29, 1963, to a large and loving family.
There were 8 male children born and 6 female children born to my mom and dad. Yeah, so a total of 14 kids.
We grew up in Forest City, Arkansas, a little small town about an hour away from Memphis.
My mom and dad took care of all 14 of us. You know, good Christmas, good Thanksgiving, good holidays, you know. We had a good upbringing.
With so many siblings, Willie had to find ways to stand out.
He wasn't one of the ones that got in trouble. I'll put it that way. He stayed out of trouble. He enjoyed school.
Early on, he had a vision problem that wasn't recognized. And once that was discovered and he got glasses, then he started to excel.
Once he started excelling and doing great in school, he was getting our parents' recognition for doing well.
After high school, Willie attended the University of Central Arkansas, but quickly realized it wasn't the right path for him. So instead, he dropped out and began working for a cookware company.
He was a team leader there, and I think that's where he met his wife, Cassandra.
He loved really hard, so like any relationship that he was in, he gave it his all. He would like counters, he would cook, flowers, all that, so he believed in treating a woman nice.
She had an older daughter that he was raising too. He treated her just like she was his daughter.
That's one of the things that I think Willie wanted for his life, was to have a family like his mom and dad had.
Willie got his wish, having 2 more children with Cassandra over the next several years.
His wife worked at night, so he'd come home, he would cook for everybody and have her food in the microwave for she could eat when she get off, stuff like that. So he was an amazing dad, amazing husband from what I saw.
He cooked more than my husband did. He'd always cook. He loved to cook and work and clean. He did it all.
He might have been a world-class father, but Willie still longed for a career he was passionate about. In the early 2000s, he decided to try being a firefighter.
He wanted to have a career, and he also wanted to help people. When he took the fireman test and stuff and he got on, he was so excited. He was one of the older guys on the fire department.
He didn't mind hard work. He worked hard, all his life in every way.
Willie's newfound success came at a cost, however. His marriage to Cassandra ended in divorce, and he found himself splitting time between the firehouse and his children.
We grew up with both our parents, and that's what he wanted to do as well. But it just didn't work out like that. He tried to make it work. They got back together, but they couldn't make it work.
In 2005, Willie got a second chance at love with a bright single mother named Felicia Price.
Walmart was his favorite store to go to. I know he used to see her all the time, and then one day I guess he got the courage to say something to her.
From my understanding of the way they said they met, he gave her his number in Walmart, and she waited a year before she called him.
My mom is a hard person to talk to, but it was amazing how, his consistency worked, going and talking to her and being very polite to her. Yeah, they got together. They loved watching movies. They hung out like best friends. They were like pretty close in that regard.
My brother, he likes strong women. She portrayed being a strong woman.
She's very straightforward, no nonsense, no silly business.
She's already divorced once, but she's been successful throughout her life. She went through college, she's got a master's degree. She had a good job with the IRS down here.
My mom and Willie took the time, and I would say about 6 years till they officially moved in together.
In 2012, after 7 years together, the couple finally decided to tie the knot.
They told us they were going to Jamaica to get married.
They didn't invite anybody. They just went off and they got married, and then came back. They seemed very happy.
With 2 children each from previous relationships, Willie and Felicia bought a large home in Olive Branch to accommodate their blended family.
He wanted to be married and wanted to settle down and, just raise his children. He just wanted a happy life.
It appeared Willie and Felicia had built the perfect life together. Now, he's lying dead on the bathroom floor of their dream home.
at the scene that day. Joshua initially tells the deputies where the gun is located, in a drawer under the kitchen sink. That is collected.
Unlike Joshua, Felicia was not open to talking.
She is in the back of a patrol car. She's kind of slumped down. I try to approach and talk to her, but she's not really responding very well.
After paramedics treat Felicia's head injury, she and her son Joshua are taken to the station for questioning. Investigators give Felicia an opportunity to tell her story, but she stays silent.
A lot of people, when they get into a situation like this, they shut down, and that's exactly what she did. She wouldn't tell me anything about her head, but the wound to her forehead seemed at the time to be self-inflicted to me, because it was perfectly straight up and down right in the center. I've seen people hit themselves in the head before, and it leaves that perfect line. That was the first thing that I had, that something wasn't really quite right.
Coming up, investigators find signs of a troubled marriage and volatile temper.
He did initially describe her as kind of a domineering personality.
And a witness comes under fire.
This is your chance to tell the whole truth, even if it's something you did that you shouldn't have done.
All right.
DeSoto County Sheriff's deputies are questioning Felicia Barden and her 23-year-old son Joshua about the fatal shooting of her husband, Willie.
You would assume that a domestic violence situation occurred based on the evidence, but it doesn't mean it necessarily did happen. At this point, we don't know why he was shot.
I don't take anything at face value when you first hear it, because everything kind of runs the gamut. So I listen to everything before I can make a determination of anything.
So far, Felicia has refused to say anything, but Joshua seems more than willing to talk.
I could tell that he really wanted to tell the story that he had, so I got him back to the office pretty quickly to interview him.
All right, from what I understand, you weren't on the scene, right? Your mom called you, so that kind of makes you a witness. But I'm going to read you your Miranda rights anyway, just so you understand where we are. Do you want me to read these to you, or are you capable of reading them yourself? You need to calm down, take a breath.
I have just anxiety. I'm just calming down as much as I can.
What happened today?
I was at work. I received a call. I can't tell me too many details because I was panicking. All I know is that she said that he was shot.
And do you know about what time she called?
7 something. I know, because I was supposed to be off work. I get a call from my mom. She said it was a horrible emergency, and I was like immediately hung up. I just felt very adrenaline filled and had to get there for the family. I was driving extra fast. In the moment, I didn't care if I get pulled over.
What did she tell you happened once you got there?
She didn't say nothing. She was just frantic.
She never told you anything?
She said she shot him.
Okay, but she didn't tell you what led up to that?
She has a bleeding and like
where?
On her head, and like she was kind of crunched. So I felt like it was like a fight that happened, maybe.
He said his mom shot Willie, his stepfather, in self-defense.
Like, well, it looks like self-defense. I wasn't there, but at the same time, in that moment, yeah, I was terrified. I don't know what happened, so just seeing the blood on her, I was scared for my mom, period.
When investigators ask him about the gun, he is open about why he knew exactly where it was.
I hid the gun in the kitchen. I just didn't want,
Where did you
just
pick
to
the
come
gun
anywhere.
from?
On the bed. It was on the bed when I came in.
So you moved the gun from the bed to the kitchen?
Yes.
Why would you move the gun?
I didn't want anything. I didn't want anything. I just thought that was the right thing to do.
Okay, I mean, that's fine.
The fact that he knew where the gun was and he said he hid the gun also implicates him as a suspect.
Joshua's answers are consistent with his 911 call, but investigators want to compare his story to the evidence at the scene.
They didn't have much to go on except what Joshua told them. At this point, they only had a dead body, and his mother has an injury, and we don't know how that occurred.
Back at the Barden house, detectives have been conducting a more thorough search, starting with Willie's body.
He was laying face down on the floor. One arm was out just a little bit, but his face was smashed into the floor. Just a little bit of blood was coming out from underneath him. When he does have his underwear on, it does appear that he is about to shower for his job. There were a spent shell casing in the bathroom underneath the cabinet. There were sleeping pills scattered all over the floor. We found a razor, an open razor blade. And we collected that because we knew she had the wound to her forehead.
While trying to make sense of the scene, investigators search every room of the house.
While they were looking through the house, they noticed that they had cameras all over the house.
There were several security cameras inside and outside the house. Notable, there was one right above the master bedroom door.
I see people put security cameras in their home, but not normally right above the master bedroom door. That was unusual for me.
You have to wonder what the security concerns were.
Whatever reason the Bardens had for installing the cameras, their presence could provide detectives with some much-needed answers.
They thought, wow, this is great for us. This is great for our investigation. If we can get that footage, we're going to know exactly what happened. That led them to try to determine where the DVR was in the house.
We did find a location upstairs in the closet where all the wires came into, but the system itself was missing.
It appeared that it was ripped out of the wall.
I saw there's a shelf with a knife that seemed to be really out of place, and wires were coming out of the ceiling.
As far as investigators are concerned, there's only one reason why someone would get rid of the recordings.
It tells us there's possibly evidence that is useful on that system.
Knowing that this is such a critical piece of evidence, the officers were prepared to do whatever it takes to try to locate this.
You'd be surprised the amount of people that throw evidence in garbage cans. And one of the detectives just happened to lift it up to look in, and there's a DVR just sitting basically on top of the garbage.
We knew that if we were able to get that information off that DVR, that it would blow the case wide open. We were either going to see evidence of a domestic violence situation or a cold-blooded killer.
After recovering the security system from the Barden's trash, detectives immediately reconnected to see if Willie Barden's shooting was caught on tape.
That's a critical piece of evidence. We're still not sure that we're going to be able to get it to work. Our concern was that we wouldn't, because at this point in the investigation, all we had was what Joshua told us.
So we had to leave it in the DVR system and go through the software contained on the DVR. Part of that was there was administrative password, and it locked it down.
The device is sent to tech specialists to unlock it as investigators consider their next steps.
That led officers to go back to Joshua. They thought, maybe Joshua knows about this. Maybe he can shed some light on why it was ripped out of the wall.
With Felicia still too upset to talk, they get Joshua back in an interrogation room and turn up the heat.
This is your chance to tell the whole, even if it's something you did that you shouldn't have done, or something that your mom had you do, this is the time. You don't want me to find out later, okay? Because there's still a whole team of people at that house doing stuff. So be honest, okay?
Joshua starts by describing what life was like in the Barden household.
When I was 18, I immediately moved out, went to college, but I was just living by myself. So my mom begged me to come to stay with her. Eventually, I moved back, and it was not that great.
Joshua did initially describe his mother as kind of a domineering personality can be difficult to be around.
Joshua says he saw Willie and his mother fight a lot, but he never actually saw him hurt her.
I witnessed, just yelling, screaming, but I would never, in my presence, let somebody touch my mom. So
that's what I'm asking. So you've seen them yell at each other, but you've never seen them
nothing physical, and I don't think he would do anything physical while I was there. My mom was she was a yeller. It's just hard to talk, whenever she wants it one way, it's gonna be that way. It's basically how she usually acts, and that's just how it is. They had normal arguments like any other couple, and that's as far as it got in my eyes.
While he never saw any violence, Joshua says his mother did accuse Willie of abuse.
He did say that Felicia, about a week prior to the shooting, told him that Willie was sexually and physically abusing her.
She told me she suspected of him poisoning her food because she was sleeping longer than she needed to.
Did she tell you that he is putting sleeping pills in her food?
Yes.
And if Willie was hurting his mother, that makes sense that he might be protecting her.
And according to Joshua, his mother wasn't Willie's only target.
Joshua also indicated in his interview with officers that he did not get along with his stepfather. He said his stepfather had pointed a gun at him during an altercation, and he also grabbed him by the throat. Joshua said that Nicholas, who is the victim's son, was present when this occurred.
Why did he get so mad? What happened in that moment?
I was asleep and I do not know. He was talking to my mom, and he doesn't like me staying there. To be honest, he doesn't like my demeanor. He said that I had a thuggish demeanor.
So far, Joshua has stuck to his initial story of how Willie was shot.
I got into the house. She was pretty hurt, just sitting there in the room.
You called the police?
Yeah, I called the police on my phone.
Did you help move anything?
Like, in what way?
Anything at all? Did you, other than the gun, did you pick up, move, alter?
Nope.
They proceeded to tell him that they found the DVR in the garbage can in the backyard.
You need to, just come clean if you know something, because, we're going to fingerprint it. Would your fingerprints be on there?
Yeah, maybe.
That quickly unraveled to him at his mother's direction, removing it, ripping it out of the wall, and throwing it in the garbage can.
She said, grab that box and throw it away. And I was like, what are you doing? Honest to God.
So you knew at that moment it wasn't right?
No, I promise to God I didn't.
Okay. Did you have any idea why she would want to throw that box away if it's can back up her story?
I have no clue.
Now we know that he has tampered with critical evidence that could possibly tell us exactly what happened.
Suspicions continue to grow when investigators follow up with Willie's son, Nicholas.
They wanted to talk to him specifically about the instance that Joshua had talked to investigators about, claiming that Willie had held a gun to his head.
I asked Nicholas about that incident, and his version was basically completely opposite of what Joshua's was.
Nicholas says that Joshua actually had a plate that he was going to throw at Willie, and that's when Willie drew his gun.
Joshua told the story that he was in his room, basically minding his own business, and Willie comes in with a gun. He did not, according to Nicholas, didn't point it at him, but basically told him, "You're not going to attack me in my own home."
Nick said that in the home was chaos all the time. It was just chaos all the time. He just got so tired of it that he had to leave. He said he couldn't take it.
That was a key piece that Joshua left out of that story. And why would he do that?
Coming up, a background check catches detectives' attention.
They said she is really domineering and difficult, and they eventually suspended her.
And when police finally crack the DVR, the video evidence is chilling.
We knew that that was the piece of the puzzle that was going to put everything together.
After poking holes in Joshua's initial account, investigators question everything he's told them about Willie Barden's murder.
He did give basically an alibi of why he wouldn't have been involved, that he was at work at Circle K. So myself and another detective, we went to the Circle K to try to see if they would let us look at their security footage.
They have video footage of him leaving the gas station after he received the call from his mother, corroborating what he said to police initially. So we knew he was at work at the time of the murder.
Despite their suspicions, it's clear Joshua couldn't have been the one who pulled the trigger.
So now that Joshua has been ruled out as a suspect, we're focusing in on Felicia. Was it a domestic violence situation? Or did Felicia just murder Willie?
Sometimes. People that kill somebody in self-defense, they will lie about some of the smaller stuff involved, but they're not going to lie about, I was basically brutally attacked enough that I had to kill somebody to save my own life. They want you to know everything that happened. So it's pretty unusual for somebody to want to claim self-defense, but then try to destroy all the evidence that would help your claim.
While specialists work on cracking the security camera footage, detectives check police records for any history of domestic violence.
What we found out with Felicia and Willie was, all the way back in 2009, we were finding police reports from Memphis where they were calling 911 on each other.
Although an arrest was never made, investigators know from experience that situations like this often escalate.
Typically, if somebody's involved in a domestic violence relationship, it happens more than once. When speaking with Felicia's family members, none of them seem to be aware of any issues going on between the couple, except Roland, who is Felicia's brother.
Right before the homicide, Felicia had told him that Willie was trying to poison her, put stuff in her food to kill her, which was basically what Joshua described in the beginning.
Being concerned for his sister, Roland did contact Willie and asked him about the allegations. Willie denied it. He said, "There's nothing going on. We'll work this out." And Roland seemed to be satisfied with that answer.
When investigators talk to the couple's friends and coworkers, however, they say Felicia was the one prone to violence.
We spoke to her work. They said she is a difficult woman to get along with, really domineering and difficult. And they eventually suspended her.
However, we could not find one person anywhere to say anything negative about Willie Barden. We spoke with both of his bosses who couldn't say nicer things about him. He was a great employee. He was always on time. He never missed work. He was pleasant. He got along with everybody.
Everybody who know him knows he's an amazing guy, funny guy. I can't even ever remember him getting mad.
According to Willie's loved ones, Felicia was a source of conflict long before they were married.
Willie wanted somebody that could work together and have something and be happy. But that's not what he got. He got somebody that wanted to control him and manipulate him and separate him from his family, including his children.
She had an air about herself that she felt like she might be better than most people. She could be a little rude and crude at times. She couldn't admit when she knew she was wrong, at all.
After I had met her, he called me and said, "Devon," he said, "what do you think about me marrying Felicia?" Willie, I said, "My first impression was not a good impression." I said, "I think she's a tiger, and you gonna be the prey."
They say things only got worse after Joshua moved in.
Willie was like a clean, very clean person, organized. But from my understanding, Josh wouldn't clean or do anything.
My brother didn't want to smoke weed in the house. He wouldn't abide by his rules. They didn't really have a good relationship at all.
It was a big kind of, argumentative thing over anything. But at the same time, people have emotions. I understand why he would be upset, because we smelled like marijuana all the time, and that's probably the thing that ticked him.
One of his coworkers at the fire department that he worked at, he had told him that somebody's got to leave the house, either him or Joshua.
In talking with Willie's other family members, they indicated that he recently, within weeks prior to the murder, told them that he was going to divorce Felicia.
And it seems Felicia knew Willie was planning to leave her as well.
Willie's brother did tell us that Willie had told Felicia that he planned on divorcing her.
That's certainly could be a motive for murder. Was it just that if she can't have him, nobody can?
Less than 24 hours into their investigation, Mississippi detectives are questioning everything they've been told about Willie Barden's death. And the one person who could clear things up still refuses to talk.
Investigators met with Felicia to see if she wanted to give a statement. She exercised her right to remain silent and asked for a lawyer.
Detectives' only chance of finding out what really happened is locked away on a security camera recording.
We had a little trouble with this particular system because we couldn't remove it from the DVR to extract the data from. So we had to leave it in the DVR system and go through the software contained on the DVR. Fortunately, in this case, we were able to bypass the administrative password. And from there, we were able to view the video and export the video.
Although the cameras do not cover the bathroom where the shooting took place, they do give investigators an extensive view of the rest of the house.
The camera right above the master bedroom door showed the stairway, the hallway, and the living area. There was a security camera in the kitchen. It showed the entire kitchen and another little hallway. There was a security camera that showed another back part of the house. That has security cameras everywhere.
From the video footage, you can tell that the day before was like any other day. You see that Willie and Felicia actually hug at one point.
She hugs him back like you would expect a husband and wife. Doesn't appear to be any animosity or fights between them. He goes into the bedroom, and that's the last time you ever see Willie.
On the morning of the shooting, Felicia appears on camera bright and early, around 6:45 a.m.
You can see her come from the master bedroom, walk down the hall, go left out the door to the garage. And when she comes back into the house, she's walking down the hall with the gun in her hand.
She has no concerns or issues. She just kind of strolls into the garage, comes out, and just kind of a slow walk with the gun in her hand. Felicia looks like a psychopath, to be honest with you. I mean, she looks like she is not bothered at all by what she is about to do.
She didn't have a care in the world. She wasn't frightened, she wasn't scared, she wasn't crying.
Investigators can only speculate about what happened next.
It looked like Willie was getting ready for work, as he normally did. He was in the bathroom, about to take a shower. We know that the gunshot was close range, so she went into that bathroom where he had no escape, no way to get out, and shot him in cold blood.
A little while later, Felicia Barden comes out of the master bedroom with a firearm and appears to go into the living room and possibly place it under a couch cushion.
She then proceeds to go to the master bedroom for approximately 3 minutes. Then she comes back out to the living area. Under that same couch cushion, she retrieves something. You can't see it, but presumably it's the gun that she just hid. Then you see her run up the stairs, presumably to unplug the DVR or get rid of it, and the video goes black.
The video also confirms Felicia's wounds had to be self-inflicted.
You can still see her face clear enough that she still does not have any wounds to her face.
It appears to be premeditated because she paved the way for a self-defense claim.
Detectives obtain a warrant for Felicia's cell phone, and its contents further prove her intent to kill her husband.
On Felicia Barden's cell phone, there was search results for how to get away with murder.
We also located a text message from the night before the murder where she had saved it as a draft, and it appeared to be a suicide text.
That would imply that this was not a spur-of-the-moment crime, that it was maybe premeditated because she had to put some thought into this message.
She was going to do this come hell or high water.
We had suspected that this would be a murder-suicide, and I think that's why she made the error of not turning those cameras off. She changed her mind and realized, I've got to get rid of the video because that's going to implicate her as the murderer.
She started to panic and wanted help. The only person that she had or could think of was her son.
To call him to a murder scene that she committed murder and get him involved reflects the type of person that she is.
I think it just boiled down to narcissism, that I'm going to be smarter than everybody and I'm going to get away with this.
Anytime you have a case like this that is potentially a domestic violence situation, the jury wants to know. They want to know that it isn't. So it was important in this trial to prove that it wasn't.
Investigators now have all the evidence they need to arrest Felicia Barden for murder. Her son Joshua is also arrested and charged with being an accessory after the fact.
Felicia didn't tell anybody anything, wouldn't even speak to her lawyer.
We did not know what her defense was going to be. So we felt that it was helpful to our case to cinch up some of the holes with Joshua. So we did approach his lawyer and asked if he would be a cooperating witness for the state, and he agreed to do that.
I didn't want to do it, but that was how I got myself free and away from the situation. And I would just basically tell the truth. You know what I'm saying? So that's, yeah. Horrible situation, horrible time.
In June 2021, 2 years after Willie Barden was shot to death, Felicia's trial finally begins.
The main witness for the prosecution was Joshua. Since he had most of the information, we also included numerous exhibits. We had Google searches from Felicia. We had the suicide note. The video footage, especially with Felicia coming down the hallway with the gun, without an injury to her forehead, was the smoking gun, no pun intended, in this case. The jury was on the edge of their seat when they knew that was coming.
Prosecutors paint a picture for the jury of a woman so psychologically disturbed that when her husband said he was leaving her, she snapped.
My goal was to prove to them that this was not a domestic violence situation, she was not a victim, but that her husband wanted a divorce, and she was not having that. She was not going to let him divorce her. She was not losing that battle.
She couldn't stand the thought of not being with Willie. I don't think she's the type of person that will let things go. And when he couldn't put up with her or her son any longer, she determined that if I can't have you, nobody's going to. I'm sure the divorce would be absolutely shameful to her. You know, she likes to put that show on for everybody. She's already divorced once, so to have a second divorce would probably be too much for her.
This woman is very calculating. She wanted Willie to look like the bad person in this situation. She wanted to look like the good person. She wanted to be remembered as a victim. I've never had a defendant scare me. She scares me.
Despite the mountain of evidence against her, Felicia still refuses to set the record straight.
Felicia did not speak during the trial, nor did she take the stand. So, in essence, there was no defense. Her attorney's hands were tied because she would not speak to her attorney.
The jury takes little time to reach a verdict.
Felicia Barden was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without parole.
He gave her everything, like everything she asked for, he gave it to her. She could never be satisfied, and it's kind of befitting that she's in prison. She has control of nothing now, you know, trying to control someone. Now she's being controlled.
The whole situation's horrible. Just love my mom always. She loves me. Like, once you take the sadness out of it, the emotions out of it, it just taught me what you're supposed to do in certain situations, even though you hate it. It's just a lot of emotions.
Willie was a good man, gone too soon. He loved everybody. He was nice to everybody. Everybody loved him.
During the holidays and the time we share together, we send out a prayer for them. And we know, Willie watching over us.
I miss him. I love him. I love his children. And I want them to be okay. I know that, this time helps, but it does not heal.
People choose to walk with God or they choose to walk with Satan. After her choice is made, there was no redemption for her.
The snow didn't just fall that night, it erased things. Footprints, tire tracks, time itself. And whatever happened inside that house, it was swallowed whole before anyone even knew to look. January 2000. A quiet Minnesota suburb wrapped in winter silence. The kind of silence that feels safe, predictable, permanent. Streets lined with modest homes, porch lights glowing soft against the snow, the world moving slowly under a sky that never quite brightened. Nothing about that night suggested violence. Nothing suggested that by morning, the town would be holding its breath. It began with absence, the kind that doesn't make noise at first. A missed call, a door that stayed closed too long, a routine broken just enough to make someone uneasy. She was supposed to show up. She didn't. At first, no one panicked. People have off days. They oversleep. They forget. Life slips. But hours passed. Then more. Calls went unanswered. Messages unread. And somewhere between concern and dread, someone made the call. When officers arrived, there was no urgency in their steps yet. No sirens. No flashing lights. Just a routine welfare check. Another door. Another quiet street. The house stood exactly as it should. No broken glass. No forced entry. No signs of chaos. Just stillness. But stillness in cases like this is never neutral. It's a warning. The front door wasn't locked. That was the first detail that didn't fit. Inside, the air felt wrong. Warm but heavy, like something had happened that the walls hadn't yet released. The living room was undisturbed, couch cushions in place, a folded blanket, a remote resting exactly where it should be. Normal. Too normal. The kitchen told a slightly different story. A mug sat near the sink, coffee half finished. The surface cold now, but not long enough to forget the warmth it once held. The keys on the counter. Phone missing. That mattered. People leave without wallets sometimes. Forget jackets. Misplace keys. But not their phone. Not in 2000, not when it had already become the one thing people kept close. Officers moved deeper into the house. Each step slower. Each room quieter. And then the hallway. That's where everything stopped pretending. She was there, lying on the floor as if she had simply collapsed mid-step.
No overturned furniture.
No broken objects. No signs of a struggle that matched the finality of what had happened. But the absence of chaos wasn't calm. It was control. Her body told a story the room refused to show. This wasn't sudden. This wasn't accidental. This was intentional. And whoever had done it had taken their time. No weapon was immediately visible. No obvious wounds that explained everything at first glance. Just stillness. Final. Absolute. Officers called it in. This time, with urgency. Within hours, the house transformed. Tapes sealed off the perimeter. Patrol cars lined the street. Neighbors gathered at a distance, whispering, watching, trying to understand how something like this could happen here. Because this wasn't supposed to be that kind of place. It never is. Investigators began their work methodically. Every inch of the house was processed, dusting for prints, photographing every surface, cataloging every object. They were looking for disruption. They found almost none. No forced entry suggested one thing: she knew her killer or she never saw them coming. That distinction mattered. A lot. Friends were questioned first, then coworkers, then family. Everyone said the same thing in different ways. She was normal.
Happy.
No known enemies.
No threats.
No warning signs. But crimes like this don't emerge from nothing. Somewhere, something had shifted. The timeline was reconstructed carefully. Her last confirmed sighting, early evening. A quick errand. A short phone call. Nothing unusual. Nothing that hinted at what would follow. And then silence. Investigators turned to the physical evidence. A partial fingerprint was lifted near the hallway. Not clean enough for immediate identification. But it didn't belong. That much was clear. Then came the discovery that would haunt the case for years. DNA. Trace amounts. Barely there. Recovered from a surface that suggested proximity, contact, presence. In 2000, it wasn't the breakthrough it would later become. Back then it was fragile. Incomplete. A whisper of something real, trapped in technology that couldn't yet hear it properly. Still, they preserved it.
Carefully.
Because sometimes the smallest detail becomes everything, just not right away. Days passed. Leads poured in. Tips from the public. Sightings. Suspicions. Most of them led nowhere. One neighbor thought they heard something, a thud, maybe. Another mentioned a car that didn't belong. But nothing held. Nothing connected. And with each dead end, the shape of the case became clearer. This wasn't impulsive. This wasn't messy. This was someone who knew how to leave without being seen. Someone who understood timing. Control. Silence. The kind of person who doesn't panic. The kind of person who plans. That realization changed everything, and nothing at the same time. Because knowing what kind of person you're looking for doesn't mean you know who they are. Weeks turned into months. The investigation slowed. Not from lack of effort, but from lack of direction. Every interview circled back to the same place. Every theory collapsed under scrutiny. The fingerprint didn't match anyone in the system. The DNA sat, waiting for a future that hadn't arrived yet. And the town changed. Doors that once stayed unlocked were now bolted shut. Lights stayed on longer at night. People stopped trusting the quiet. Because the quiet had lied to them. A year passed. Then another. The case file thickened with reports, interviews, lab results, all documenting what had been done and what hadn't been found. Eventually, the label came. Cold case. two words that sound clinical, detached. But inside them is something heavier.
Time.
Time passing without answers. Time eroding urgency. Time turning something sharp and immediate into something distant and unresolved. But for some, it never became distant. The detectives who worked the case carried it with them. Because there were details that didn't sit right. Details that felt unfinished. The lack of forced entry. The controlled scene. The minimal evidence. It suggested experience. And experience suggested repetition. But there were no confirmed links. No similar cases that lined up cleanly. Just a feeling. And in investigations like this, feelings don't close cases. Evidence does. By 2005, advances in forensic science offered a flicker of hope. The DNA was retested, refined, analyzed with better tools. But still no match. The profile was too partial, too incomplete.
It pointed to someone,
but not clearly enough. Another door closed. The file returned to storage, but not to sleep. Because evidence doesn't age the way people do. It waits. Patient. Unchanging. Until the world catches up to it. Years moved on. New cases came in. New priorities took over. But every so often, someone would reopen that file. Flip through the pages. Look at the photos. And feel that same quiet resistance. Like the case wasn't finished speaking. And then something shifted. Not in the case itself, but in the world around it. Technology evolved. Databases expanded. DNA analysis became sharper,
faster,
more precise. What once looked like noise started to form patterns. The sample from 2000 was pulled again, tested again. Not because they expected a miracle, but because sometimes persistence is the only tool left. This time, the results were different. Not complete. Not definitive. But closer. A partial profile began to take shape. Stronger than before.
Clearer. Alive.
And suddenly, the case that had been buried under years of silence started to move. Investigators leaned in again. Old notes were re-examined. Old interviews replayed. And one name, buried deep in the early stages of the investigation, began to surface. Not loudly. Not obviously. But enough to stand out. A person who had been questioned briefly. Cleared quickly. Forgotten almost immediately. Because at the time there was nothing tying them to the scene. No evidence. No reason to push further. But now, with the DNA whispering something new, that decision didn't feel as solid as it once had. The timeline around that individual was revisited. Details that once seemed insignificant weren't anymore. An alibi that held under casual questioning started to show strain under scrutiny. Small inconsistencies. Minor gaps. Nothing explosive. But enough to matter. Because in a case built on almost nothing, even the smallest crack can split everything open. Investigators didn't rush. They couldn't. After years of silence, one mistake could bury it again. So they moved carefully.
Quietly.
Following threads that had been invisible before. And as they pulled, the case began to change shape. What once looked like a random act now hinted at something more deliberate. More controlled. More familiar. Like the person who entered that house hadn't hesitated. Hadn't improvised. Hadn't panicked. They had known exactly what they were doing. And that meant one thing. They had done something like it before. Or they had thought about it long enough to make it look that way. Either possibility was dangerous. Because it meant the truth wasn't just buried in the past. It had been walking freely all this time, and it had only taken one thing to start uncovering it. A fragment. A trace. A piece of DNA too small to matter in 2000, but now impossible to ignore. And as that fragment began to align with something real, the silence that had protected the truth for years started to break. The silence didn't shatter all at once, it cracked. Slow, uneven, almost invisible at first. A cold case doesn't wake up like a storm. It stirs like something buried too long, pushing upward through layers of time, forcing its way back into the present whether anyone is ready or not. And now, after years of stillness, this one was moving again. The DNA sample, once dismissed as too weak, too incomplete, was no longer quiet. Technology had caught up. What had once been noise was now structure. What had once been fragments were beginning to form identity. Not a name. Not yet. But something closer than anyone had ever been. Investigators didn't celebrate. They didn't rush to conclusions. Cases like this punish impatience. They reward restraint. So they slowed everything down. The evidence was reprocessed from the beginning, not just the DNA. Everything. Every photograph from the scene. Every report. Every note scribbled in the margins of interviews that had gone nowhere. Because sometimes the answer isn't in what you find, it's in what you overlooked. The house was re-examined through memory and documentation. The hallway, the positioning of the body, the absence of disruption. It still didn't feel like a crime of opportunity. It felt contained. Like whoever entered that house didn't hesitate. Didn't search. Didn't wander. They moved with purpose. That detail kept returning. Over and over again. And now, with the DNA forming a partial profile, that sense of purpose became something else. Intent. Deliberate. Focused. Familiar. Investigators began cross-referencing the emerging DNA markers against updated databases. Millions of entries now, far beyond what existed in 2000. Offenders, arrestees, unknown profiles linked to other crimes. At first, nothing. Then something close. Not a match. A connection. Partial overlap. Shared markers that didn't confirm identity, but suggested relation. A relative. That changed everything. Because now the search widened. Not for one person, but for a family line. Genealogical tracing began. Slow. Complex. A process that required patience and precision. Building trees from fragments. Connecting distant branches. Following lines that stretched across states, across decades. Names started appearing. Dozens at first. Then narrowed. Filtered by age. Location. Proximity to Minnesota in 2000. And that's when one name rose again, clear this time. Not just a forgotten entry in an old report. A viable lead. Back in the original investigation, this person had been peripheral. Someone who crossed paths with the victim occasionally. Not close enough to raise suspicion. Not distant enough to be irrelevant. Just present. At the time, they had cooperated. Answered questions. Provided an alibi. Nothing in their behavior had triggered alarm. So they were released from focus. Moved aside. Left behind. But now, under a different lens, that same interaction looked different. Not suspicious. But incomplete. And incomplete was enough. Investigators pulled everything they had on this individual. Old employment records. Addresses. Association. Movements around the time of the crime. The alibi was revisited. Back then it had been accepted. Now it was dissected. Minute by minute. Claim by claim. And slowly something began to shift. Not collapse. Not fall apart. Just loosen. The timeline didn't break, but it bent. There were gaps. Small. Subtle. But real. Time unaccounted for. Moments that relied on memory instead of verification. And memory, after years, becomes unreliable. That was the first pressure point. The second came from behavior. In 2000, the individual had appeared calm. Cooperative. Almost too cooperative. They had offered details without being asked. Clarified things that didn't require clarification. At the time, it read as helpful. Now it felt rehearsed. Not enough to accuse, but enough to notice. Investigators didn't approach them immediately. They couldn't. Not yet. Instead, they watched. Quietly. Reconstructed their life over the past decade. Where they had gone. What they had done. Whether anything else, anything at all, echoed the pattern from that night. That's when another thread appeared. Thin. Barely visible. A report from a neighboring county. Years after the original crime. A break-in. No forced entry. A woman alone. No fatal outcome, but the same unsettling detail.
No struggle. No noise.
No clear explanation of how the intruder had entered or left. The case had been dismissed as inconclusive. But now, under this light, it didn't feel isolated anymore. It felt connected. Not proven. But possible. And possibility is enough to reopen doors. Investigators began comparing the two cases. Entry points. Timelines. Behavioral patterns. What they found wasn't identical, but it was similar in ways that mattered. Control. Silence. Precision. The absence of chaos. These weren't coincidences. They were choices. And choices form patterns. The DNA from the second case was tested. Hopes were low. Years had passed. Evidence degrades. But this time something held. Another partial profile. Not complete. But when placed beside the first, the alignment was undeniable. Not perfect. But close enough to suggest the same source. Or someone from the same bloodline. Now the case wasn't just reopened. It was expanding. What had once been a single unsolved crime was becoming something larger. Something layered. And at the center of it, that same individual. Still not charged. Still not publicly named. But no longer peripheral. No longer forgotten. The investigation tightened. Surveillance began. Movements tracked.
Contact monitored.
Not aggressively, carefully. Because one misstep could alert them. And if they ran the case, could collapse all over again. Meanwhile, forensic teams continued refining the DNA profile. Each advancement pulling it closer to clarity. Each test reducing uncertainty. Until finally they reached a threshold. Not absolute. But strong enough. Strong enough to compare directly. But there was a problem. They needed a sample. A direct one. And they couldn't just ask for it. Not without revealing everything. So they waited. Watched. Looked for opportunity. Something discarded. Something left behind. A cup. A cigarette. A piece of trash. Anything that could legally be collected without confrontation. Days turned into weeks. Then, finally it happened. A simple moment. Ordinary. Unremarkable. The kind of moment that passes without notice. But this time, it was everything. The sample was collected.
Sent to the lab.
processed with a level of care that bordered on obsession. Because this wasn't just another test. This was the moment. The point where years of silence would either break or deepen. The results didn't come quickly. They never do. And waiting in cases like this is its own kind of tension. Because once you know what you're looking for, every second, without confirmation feels louder. Finally, the call came. Not dramatic. Not loud.
Just a voice. Calm. Precise. Certain.
It was a match. Not partial. Not probable. Definitive. The DNA from the scene in 2000 belonged to them. And just like that, the cold case wasn't cold anymore. It was alive. And it had a name. Investigators didn't rush in. They didn't make arrests immediately. Because this wasn't just about proving presence. It was about proving action. Intent. Opportunity. They needed to build it carefully. Layer by layer. Because after all these years, one mistake could still undo everything. But inside the department, the shift was undeniable. The case that had haunted files, desks, and memories for over a decade was finally turning. The silence had broken. The fragments had aligned. And the person who had walked into that house on a winter night in 2000 believing they had left nothing behind had been wrong. They had left something. Something invisible. Something patient. Something that had waited years for the world to catch up. And now that it had, there was no going back. The moment the DNA came back, everything changed, but nothing moved. Not yet. Inside the lab, it was definitive.
Clean.
Unarguable. The profile pulled from that quiet hallway in 2000 now had a name attached to it. A living, breathing person who had walked freely for years without knowing that a fragment of themselves had been left behind, waiting, preserved in silence. But outside that room, the world remained still. Because knowing and proving are not the same thing. Investigators understood that better than anyone, a match could open the door, but it wouldn't close the case. Not by itself.
Not after all this time.
They needed more than presence. They needed narrative.
Motive.
Opportunity. They needed to rebuild a night that had been buried under layers of snow, memory, and lost time. So they didn't move in. They stepped back. They watched. The suspect, no longer just a name in a file, no longer a distant possibility, continued their life as if nothing had shifted. Routine. Predictable. Controlled. The same quiet pattern that had kept them invisible in 2000 still held. That was the first thing investigators noticed. Consistency. No sudden changes. No signs of panic. No attempt to disappear. If they knew, they weren't showing it. And that raised a question no one could ignore. Had they always been this controlled? Or had they simply never needed to be anything else?
Surveillance intensified.
Quiet, layered, deliberate. Movements logged. Patterns mapped. Contacts identified. Every detail mattered now because every detail could be the thread that tied everything together. Meanwhile, inside the investigation room, the past was being reconstructed with surgical precision. They returned to the house again. Not physically, but through records, photographs, diagrams. Every inch of that space was revisited as if the crime had happened yesterday. The hallway. The position of the body. The lack of disturbance. It still didn't read like a struggle. It read like an interruption. Like the victim had been caught between moments, mid-step, mid-thought, before anything could register as danger. That detail mattered more now than it ever had before. Because it suggested familiarity. Not necessarily personal, but situational. Whoever entered that house knew how to do it without triggering alarm. No forced entry meant one of two things. She let them in. Or they didn't need permission. Investigators began re-examining her relationships with a sharper lens. Not just close connections, but peripheral ones. People who existed on the edge of her daily life. The kind of people you recognize but don't question. The suspect fit that category perfectly. Not a stranger. Not close enough to raise suspicion. Just known. And that kind of familiarity is dangerous. Because it lowers defenses. It creates openings. And openings are all someone like this needs. The timeline was rebuilt again, this time anchored around the suspect's movements rather than the victim's. Where were they that night? What did they do? Who could confirm it? At first glance, the answers hadn't changed since 2000. But under pressure, details began to shift. Not dramatically. Just enough. An estimated time became uncertain. A location became approximate. A memory lost its sharpness. None of it proved anything. But together it formed a pattern of instability. And instability, in a case built on control, stands out. Investigators brought in behavioral analysts, experts who specialize in what isn't visible, the choices behind actions, the psychology that shapes silence. They studied the crime scene, the lack of struggle, the precision, the minimal evidence left behind. Their conclusion wasn't comforting. This wasn't impulsive. This wasn't a moment of rage. This was calculated. Organized. Someone who understood how to enter, act, and leave without creating chaos. Someone who didn't panic. Someone who expected to succeed. And that kind of confidence doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from repetition. Or preparation. Either way, it meant one thing. This night in 2000 wasn't random. Back in the present, the investigation expanded again. Financial records were pulled. Old phone logs, what remained of them, were reviewed. Associates were identified and quietly questioned. No one was told the full truth. Not yet. Because once the truth leaves containment, it spreads. And if it reached the wrong person too soon, everything could unravel. The suspect remained unaware. Or, at least appeared to be. But investigators didn't trust appearances anymore. They had learned that lesson the hard way. So they prepared. The interview strategy was built slowly.
Carefully.
This wouldn't be an accusation. Not at first. It would be a conversation. A reopening of the past. A chance to observe. To listen. To see what changed and what didn't. Because after all these years, memory becomes fragile. But lies? Lies need consistency. And consistency breaks under pressure. The day came without announcement.
No flashing lights.
No dramatic entry. Just a request.
Come.
Routine. A follow-up on an old case. The suspect agreed. Of course they did. That was expected. Inside the interview room, nothing looked unusual. A table, 2 chairs, neutral walls. A space designed to feel controlled. But control in this moment belonged to the investigators. They started simple. Background questions. Routine details. Nothing confrontational. The suspect responded easily.
Calm.
Measured. Just like before. But then the timeline. That's where the first hesitation appeared.
Small.
Barely noticeable. A pause before answering. A correction mid-sentence. Nothing definitive. But enough. Investigators didn't react. They moved forward. Layer by layer. Revisiting details that had been discussed years ago. Comparing responses. Watching for shifts. And they came. Subtle. But consistent. Details that once aligned no longer did. Not completely. Memory after years can change. But patterns of change, those tell a different story. The suspect maintained composure. Voice steady. Posture controlled. But the cracks were there. Not visible to an untrained eye, but clear to those who had spent years waiting for this moment. And then they introduced it.
Carefully.
The idea of new evidence. Not specifics. Just enough to create pressure. To shift the balance. And, for the first time, something changed. Not in what was said, but in how it was said. A slight tightening. A measure response that came just a fraction too quickly. As if prepared. As if anticipated. The investigators didn't push further. Not yet. Because this wasn't about forcing a confession. It was about building inevitability. The interview ended without confrontation. Without accusation. But the tone had shifted. The past was no longer buried. And the suspect knew it. Outside that room, the case accelerated. Search warrants were prepared. Legal frameworks built. Every step documented with precision. Because now, the margin for error was gone. The DNA had given them a name. The interview had given them direction. Now they needed the final pieces. Something tangible. Something undeniable. The kind of evidence that doesn't fade with time. Because time had already taken enough. It had taken clarity. It had taken memory. But it hadn't taken everything. Somewhere something remained. And investigators were closing in. The quiet suburb that once believed it was safe had carried this story for years without resolution. A wound that never fully closed. A question that never found its answer. But now, after all this time, the silence was breaking for good. Not with noise. Not with chaos. But with something far more dangerous.
Truth. Slow.
Relentless. And impossible to stop once it begins. The truth didn't arrive like a confession, it assembled itself.
Piece by piece.
Document by document. A quiet accumulation of facts that, on their own, seemed small. But together they formed something heavy. Something impossible to ignore. After the interview, the atmosphere inside the investigation shifted. Not louder. Not faster. Just sharper. Every move now carried weight because the margin for error had vanished. There was no room left for assumption. Only proof. Search warrants were signed in silence.
No spectacle. No headlines.
Just ink on paper and a plan that had been building for years without anyone outside that room knowing it. The suspect's home became the next focal point. From the outside, it looked ordinary. The kind of place you pass without thinking twice. Lawn trimmed. Windows clean. Nothing about it suggested the weight it carried inside. That was the pattern. Normal on the surface. Controlled underneath. Investigators entered with precision. Every step documented. Every item cataloged. Not a raid, an excavation. Because this wasn't about finding something obvious. It was about uncovering what had been hidden in plain sight. Drawers opened. Closets emptied. Boxes pulled from corners that hadn't been touched in years. Most of it was nothing. Everyday objects. Clothing. Old paperwork. The residue of a life lived quietly. But buried within that ordinary, there were anomalies. A collection of items that didn't belong together. Keepsakes with no clear origin. Objects tied to no known memory. Individually, they meant little. Together, they suggested something else. Retention. A need to keep. To hold on to fragments of moments that should have been forgotten. Investigators didn't jump to conclusions. They documented everything. Because in cases like this, meaning doesn't come from a single object, it comes from context. And context was building. Digital records were next. Old devices, hard drives, storage media that hadn't been accessed in years. Technology had changed since 2000, but data has a way of lingering. Files were recovered. Fragments of searches. Locations.
Times.
Nothing explicit. Nothing that screamed guilt. But enough to draw lines. Lines that led back to that night. Back to the victim. Back to a presence that had never been fully explained. Meanwhile, forensic teams re-examined the physical evidence from the original scene with a level of scrutiny that hadn't been possible 2 decades earlier. Advanced testing. Deeper analysis. Microscopic traces that once meant nothing now carried weight. The DNA match had already established presence. Now, they were looking for interaction. Transfer. Proof that went beyond being there to being involved. Fibers were compared. Particles analyzed. Tiny, almost invisible elements that connected environments, movements, contact. And slowly, quietly those connections began to appear. Not dramatic. Not obvious. But consistent. A fiber that aligned with material found in the suspect's home. A trace that suggested proximity beyond coincidence. Each piece alone was fragile. Together they were becoming structure. Back in the interview room, a second meeting was arranged. This time, the tone was different.
Still calm.
Still controlled. But no longer casual. The suspect entered the room with the same composure. But composure, investigators knew, can be a mask that only works until it doesn't. They began again with the past. Revisiting the timeline. The alibi. But this time, the questions were sharper. More precise. Less room to adjust. The suspect answered. Still steady. Still controlled. But the gaps they were widening. Details that had shifted before shifted further. Moments that had once been certain now blurred. And then, without warning, the evidence was introduced.
Not all of it.
Just enough. The DNA. Presented not as possibility, but as fact. The reaction wasn't explosive.
No sudden breakdown. No immediate denial.
Just a pause. A silence that lasted a fraction too long. And in that silence, everything changed. Because for the first time, control slipped. Just slightly. But enough. The suspect recovered quickly. Questions were deflected. Explanations offered. A contact explained away. Coincidence suggested. But the tone had shifted. Confidence replaced with calculation. Every word now measured against something unseen. And that's when investigators knew they were close. Because when someone starts adjusting their story in real time, it means the truth is pressing in. The interview ended again without arrest. But this time, the space between conversation and confrontation had narrowed. Outside, the case tightened further. Witnesses were recontacted. People who had been part of the original investigation were brought back in. Memories revisited. Details re-examined. And something unexpected began to surface. Not new information. Old information seen differently. A neighbor who had once mentioned a car now remembered its color more clearly. A timeline that had felt vague now aligned with a specific window. Individually, these weren't breakthroughs. But together they reinforced something critical. The suspect had opportunity. And now, with the DNA, opportunity wasn't enough. It was dangerous. Investigators began constructing the sequence. Not speculation. Reconstruction. Based on evidence. Based on behavior. Based on everything that had been learned. A person enters the house without force.
No alarm.
No resistance. A moment of contact. Controlled.
Quiet.
deliberate. And then exit.
Clean. Precise.
Leaving behind almost nothing. Almost. Because the almost is where cases like this survive. That single fragment of DNA. That microscopic trace. The one thing that refused to disappear. Back in the present, pressure was building. Not publicly, but internally. Every piece of evidence added weight. Every connection reduced doubt. Until the case reached a point where waiting became risk. Because the longer it stayed unresolved, the more fragile it became. Memories fade. Evidence degrades. Opportunities close. So the decision was made. The next step wouldn't be another interview. It would be action. But action had to be exact. Because after all these years, failure wasn't an option. The arrest warrant was prepared with meticulous care. Every detail supported. Every claim backed. A structure built to withstand scrutiny. Because once it moved forward, there would be no stepping back. The night before, the town remained quiet. Unaware. Unchanged. The same streets. The same houses. The same sense of calm that had existed in 2000. But beneath that calm, something was shifting. A story that had remained unfinished for years was approaching its end. Not quietly. Not gently. But inevitably. Morning came without warning. Officers moved in.
No chaos. No spectacle.
Just precision. The suspect was taken into custody without resistance. No attempt to flee.
No confrontation.
Just acceptance. And that was its own kind of silence. Inside the department, the weight of the moment settled in. Years of work. Years of waiting. All leading here. But even now it wasn't over. Because an arrest is not an ending. It's a beginning. A new phase. Where evidence becomes argument. Where truth is tested. Where silence is forced to speak. And in this case, the silence had lasted too long. As the suspect sat in custody, the case that had once been labeled cold now burned with clarity. The fragments had aligned. The patterns had emerged. The truth, buried under years of time and snow, had finally surfaced. But even as it did, one question lingered. Not about who. Not anymore.
But why?
Because understanding what happened is one thing. Understanding why is something else entirely. And sometimes that answer is the one that never fully comes. Even when everything else does. The arrest didn't end the silence. It changed its shape. For years, silence had protected the truth. It had hidden it, preserved it, allowed it to exist without consequence. Now, that same silence sat across from investigators in a small, controlled room, wearing a human face, breathing steadily, waiting. The suspect didn't speak at first. They didn't have to. Because everything that needed to be said was already in motion. Fingerprints processed. DNA confirmed. Evidence catalogued. The structure of the case had been built piece by piece, and now it stood solid enough to hold weight. But there was still something missing. Not proof. Understanding. And understanding in a case like this isn't just about curiosity, it's about clarity. It's about showing that what happened wasn't a random fracture in reality, but a sequence, a decision, a moment that led to another until it became irreversible. The interrogation began slowly.
No accusations.
No raised voices. Just questions. Simple ones at first.
Name. Background.
Routine. The suspect answered calmly.
No hesitation.
No visible stress. They had been here before. Not in this room, not in this moment, but in situations where control mattered. And control was still there. Investigators didn't challenge it immediately. They let it exist. Because control, when left alone, tends to reveal itself. The timeline came next. January 2000. Where were you? What were you doing? Who can confirm it? The same questions that had been asked years ago. The same answers almost. But almost is where everything changes. Details that had once been clear were now softened. Times became approximate. Movements became less defined. The suspect wasn't contradicting themselves directly. They were drifting. And drift, in a case anchored by evidence, creates distance. Investigators leaned in. Not physically, but strategically. They began introducing fixed points. Moments that couldn't be moved. The victim's last confirmed activity. The estimated time of death. The window in which everything had happened. And slowly, that drifting timeline began to compress. The suspect's version of events had less space to exist. Less room to adjust. And then, without warning, the foundation shifted. The DNA was placed on the table. Not literally, but clearly. Explained. Detailed. Unavoidable. The suspect listened.
Still calm.
Still controlled. But something changed. It wasn't in their voice. It wasn't in their posture. It was in the pause. A fraction longer than before. A gap where control recalibrated. And in that gap, truth pressed forward. The response came carefully. An explanation. Contact. Innocent. Accidental. Something that could be dismissed. But the explanation didn't match the evidence. Not completely. Because the DNA wasn't in a place that suggested coincidence. It suggested proximity. Interaction. Presence at a moment that couldn't be explained away easily. Investigators didn't argue. They didn't need to. They let the weight of the evidence sit. Because pressure, applied correctly, doesn't come from force. It comes from inevitability. The questioning shifted. Not aggressive, but precise. Focusing on small details. Revisiting specific moments. Watching for changes. And they came. Subtle. But consistent. A word replaced. A sequence altered. A detail omitted. Each change small enough to seem insignificant. But together they told a story. Not the story of what happened, but the story of someone trying to stay ahead of it. The interrogation stretched on. Time became irrelevant. Because in that room, there were only two forces. Control. And truth. And one of them was starting to weaken. Investigators introduced the second case. The one from the neighboring county. Similar pattern. Same silence. Same absence of forced entry. The suspect's reaction was minimal. Almost non-existent. But minimal isn't neutral. Minimal is controlled. And control, again, was slipping. Because now the narrative was expanding. This wasn't just about one night. One victim. One mistake. It was about possibility.
Pattern.
Repetition. The suspect denied any connection. Of course they did. But denial, when faced with structure, begins to sound different. Less like certainty. More like resistance. And resistance over time breaks. The interrogation paused. Not because it had to, but because it was strategic. Time outside the room can be more powerful than time inside it. Because when someone is left alone with what they've just heard, with what they now know, investigators have, the mind begins to work against itself. Hours passed. Then the door opened again. The atmosphere had shifted.
Slightly.
But enough. The suspect looked the same. But something behind that composure had changed. Fatigue. Not physical. Mental. The kind that comes from holding a narrative together while it's being pulled apart. Investigators didn't start where they left off. They started somewhere else. Emotion. Not accusation. Not evidence. Just the weight of what had happened. A life ended. A family left without answers. A community changed forever. For the first time, the suspect didn't respond immediately. Silence. Real silence. Not controlled. Not strategic. Just present. And in that silence, something surfaced. Not a confession. Not yet. But something closer to truth than anything that had come before. A shift. A crack. A moment where the narrative they had maintained for years didn't quite hold. Investigators didn't push. They let it exist. Because forcing it could close it again. And after all this time, they couldn't afford that. The questioning returned to the timeline. But now it was different. More direct. More anchored. Less room to move. The suspect answered. But the answers were slower. Less certain. And then it happened. Not a full admission. Not a clear statement. Just a single detail. Out of place. Unprompted. A detail that hadn't been mentioned before. A detail that only someone present could know. The room didn't react. But everything inside it changed. Because that was the moment. The point where the barrier between denial and truth began to collapse. The suspect realized it too. The silence that followed was heavier than anything that had come before. Because now it wasn't about what investigators knew. It was about what the suspect had revealed. And there was no taking that back. The interrogation ended there. Not because it was finished, but because it had reached its purpose. The truth had surfaced. Not fully, but enough. Outside the room, the case transformed again. What had been built through evidence was now supported by something else. Something human. Something flawed. Something that couldn't be explained away by coincidence. The next phase would be different. Courtrooms instead of interview rooms. Arguments instead of questions. But the foundation was set. Solid. Unshakable. Years of silence had led to this. A moment where everything aligned. Where fragments became structure. Where a single mistake, left behind in 2000, had grown into something impossible to ignore. The town that had once lived in uncertainty now stood on the edge of resolution. Not complete. Not yet. But closer than it had ever been. And at the center of it all the same truth that had waited patiently for years. Unseen. Unheard. But never gone. Because some things don't disappear. They wait. Until the world is ready to hear them. The case didn't slow down after the interrogation, it hardened. What had once been fragments, speculation, instinct was now structure. Evidence layered with behavior, reinforced by a moment in that room that couldn't be undone. Not a full confession, not a clear admission, but something more dangerous than either. A detail that didn't belong to anyone except the person who had been there. And now, everything moved forward with a different kind of gravity. Inside the prosecution's office, the file was no longer just thick, it was alive. Pages filled with timelines, forensic reports, transcripts, diagrams of a house that had become more than a place. It was a map of decisions, of movement, of intent. Every piece had to align. Because this wasn't just about proving presence anymore. It was about proving inevitability. The suspect had been in that house. The DNA said so. The behavior supported it. The timeline was closing in. But the law required something more. It required a story that couldn't be broken. So that's what they built. Slowly, methodically, without gaps. They started with the victim. Not as a memory, but as a timeline. The last hours of her life reconstructed down to the smallest detail. Where she went, what she did,
who she spoke to.
The ordinary rhythm of a day that ended without warning. Then they placed the suspect into that same rhythm. Overlaying movements. Opportunities. Moments where paths could cross. And they did. Not constantly. Not obviously. But enough. Enough to establish proximity. Enough to show that this wasn't coincidence. That this wasn't random. Then came the house. The absence of forced entry became central. Because it meant something simple, but powerful. Whoever entered didn't break in. They were allowed in. Or they entered in a way that didn't trigger fear. The suspect fit that possibility. Not close. But familiar. Familiar enough to lower suspicion. Familiar enough to pass through that door without resistance. The prosecution leaned into that. Because it explained the silence. The lack of struggle. The control. But control alone wasn't enough. They needed connection. So they returned to the evidence. The fibers. The trace materials. Microscopic details that had once been overlooked. Now re-examined with precision. Each one placed carefully into the narrative. A fiber that matched. A particle that aligned. Individually, they could be questioned. Together, they became pattern. And patterns don't happen by accident. Meanwhile, the defense was preparing. Because in a case like this, time is both strength and weakness. Years had passed. Memories faded. Evidence aged. And that gave them room. Room to question. Room to create doubt. They didn't need to prove innocence. They only needed to challenge certainty. And certainty, no matter how strong, can always be tested. The prosecution knew that. So they reinforced everything. Every claim backed by multiple points. Every timeline supported by more than one source. Because once this entered the courtroom, every detail would be attacked. The interrogation transcript became a focal point. Not for what it said directly, but for what it revealed. The hesitation. The shift in tone. The detail that slipped through. The prosecution framed it carefully. Not as a confession, but as knowledge. Knowledge that couldn't exist without presence. And presence, combined with DNA, combined with opportunity, became something much heavier. The suspect, now in custody, maintained composure. No public statements. No visible reaction. Just silence. But this silence was different from before. Before, it had been protection. Now it felt like containment. As if everything inside was being held back, not hidden. Because the structure built around them was closing. And there was less and less space to move. Outside, the community began to shift again. News spread slowly at first. Then, all at once, the cold case that had lived in memory for years was no longer unresolved. There was a suspect. An arrest. A possibility of answers. For some, it brought relief. For others, it reopened something they had tried to bury. Because resolution doesn't erase the past. It sharpens it. Faces returned to memory.
Moments replaya.
Questions resurfaced. Why her? Why then? Why like this? Questions that might never have complete answers. But now they had direction. Back inside the case, the prosecution focused on the sequence. Not just what happened, but how it happened. The entry. The moment of contact. The control. The exit. Each step reconstructed not as theory, but as probability supported by evidence. Because in the absence of direct witnesses, the story must be built from what remains. And what remained was enough. The suspect's past was examined. Not to create prejudice, but to identify pattern, behavior, habits. Anything that aligned with the structure of the crime. Nothing overt surfaced. No record that screamed violence. No history that made the conclusion obvious. But that in itself became part of the narrative. Because some individuals don't leave visible trails. They operate within normalcy. They blend. They become invisible until something forces them into focus. And in this case, that something was a fragment of DNA. A trace too small to matter at the time. Now large enough to define everything. The second case, the one from the neighboring county, was considered carefully. Similarities were undeniable. But similarity isn't proof. So it was positioned as context, not accusation. A pattern that suggested possibility, without overreaching. Because overreach creates weakness. And weakness creates doubt. Everything had to be precise, contained, unbreakable. The trial preparation became relentless. Mock arguments, scenario testing, every angle explored, every weakness addressed. Because once the case was presented, it would be dissected, and anything unprotected would be exposed. The prosecution returned, again and again, to the same point. The moment in that hallway. Because everything led there. The DNA. The behavior. The timeline. The detail revealed in interrogation. All of it converged in that single space. That single moment. A moment that had remained silent for years. Now ready to be heard. The suspect, meanwhile, remained still. No visible change.
No outward collapse.
But inside something was shifting. Because even the most controlled narrative begins to fracture when surrounded by truth. Not all at once. Not dramatically. But inevitably. And inevitability was what this case had become. Years ago, it had been uncertainty. Questions without answers. A story without an ending. Now it was something else. A structure moving toward conclusion. Not based on chance. Not based on assumption. But built from fragments that had aligned over time. The final preparations were made. The case was ready. Not perfect. No case ever is. But strong. Strong enough to stand. Strong enough to hold. Strong enough to speak for a night that had been silent for too long. And as everything moved toward the courtroom, one truth remained at the center of it all. The person who had walked into that house in 2000 had believed they were alone. That no one would see. That nothing would follow. That time would erase everything. But time hadn't erased it. It had preserved it. Protected it. Waited. Until the world was ready to understand what had been left behind. And now that it was, there was no silence left to hide in. The courtroom didn't erupt when the trial began, it tightened. A different kind of silence settled in. Not the empty silence of unanswered questions, but a dense, watchful quiet. The kind that presses down on every word, every movement, every breath. Because now, after years of waiting, the story that had lived in fragments was about to be told in full view. No more hidden files. No more private conclusions. Everything would be spoken out loud. The suspect entered without expression. No visible fear.
No visible anger.
Just the same control that had defined every step of this case from the beginning. sitting there, still, composed, as if the weight of everything surrounding them didn't exist. But it did. It was in the room, in the eyes of the people watching, in the quiet tension that hadn't left since the first moment proceedings began. The prosecution didn't rush. They couldn't. This wasn't a case built on a single piece of evidence or a single moment of truth. It was a structure, layered, deliberate, constructed over years. And structures like that aren't revealed all at once. They are unfolded.
Carefully.
The opening statement was precise. Not dramatic. Not emotional. Just controlled. A timeline, a sequence, a night that began like any other and ended in silence. The victim presented not as a memory, but as a presence, real, immediate, existing in the room through the words that described her final hours. Then slowly the shift. From her to the house. The hallway. The stillness. The absence of forced entry. The absence of struggle. Details that, on their own, seemed quiet. But together they became something else. They became intention. The prosecution made it clear, this was not chaos. This was control. And control points to a person who knows what they're doing. The defense responded exactly as expected. They didn't attack the emotion. They attacked the certainty. Years had passed. Memories fade. Evidence degrades. What was once unclear doesn't become clearer with time. It becomes more vulnerable to interpretation. That was their position. Not denial.
Doubt.
And doubt, even the smallest amount, can fracture a case. The first witnesses took the stand. Officers from 2000. Their voices steady, but marked by time. They described the scene. The stillness. The details that had stayed with them long after the case had gone cold. Nothing dramatic. Nothing exaggerated. Just facts. But facts, repeated, build weight. The jury listened. Not reacting. Not revealing. Because inside that room, reaction doesn't matter. Understanding does. Then came the forensic experts. The ones who had taken fragments and turned them into something meaningful. They explained the DNA. How it was collected. How it was preserved. How it had remained, waiting until technology caught up. The defense pushed back immediately. Contamination. Degradation. The possibility of transfer. They questioned everything. Not aggressively, but persistently. Because if they could create even a shadow of uncertainty, it would matter. The expert didn't raise their voice.
Didn't rush.
They explained the process again. Step by step.
Clear. Precise.
The match wasn't a guess. It wasn't probability. It was identity. And that identity pointed directly to the person sitting in that room. The tension shifted. Not visibly, but perceptibly. Because now the case had a center. A point that couldn't be easily moved. But the defense wasn't finished. They turned to the timeline. Opportunity. Presence doesn't equal action. Being there doesn't mean being responsible. And that was the gap they aimed to widen. They questioned the reconstruction. The assumptions. The interpretation of behavior. Because in the absence of direct witnesses, everything becomes a matter of connection. And connections can be challenged. The prosecution anticipated this. They brought the next layer. The fibers. The trace evidence. Microscopic links between the suspect and the environment of the crime. Individually weak. Collectively strong. The expert explained how these elements align. How they don't appear randomly. How they require contact.
Proximity.
Interaction. Again, the defense questioned. Alternative explanations. Environmental transfer. Coincidence. Because coincidence, even unlikely coincidence, can exist. But the prosecution wasn't relying on one coincidence. They were building a pattern. And patterns, when repeated, become difficult to dismiss. The interrogation footage was introduced. Not the entire session. Just selected moments. Carefully chosen. The hesitation.
The shift.
The detail that slipped through. The courtroom didn't react.
But the air changed.
Because this wasn't technical evidence. This was human. Unfiltered. A moment where control faltered. Where something real surfaced. The defense objected. Context. Pressure. Interpretation. They argued that behavior under interrogation isn't truth, it's reaction. And reactions can be misleading. The judge allowed it. Because the jury needed to see it. Needed to decide what it meant. Days passed. Each one adding another layer. Another piece. Another angle. The case grew heavier. Not louder. Just more complete. The prosecution returned, again and again, to the same point. The hallway. The moment. Because everything led there. The DNA. The fibers. The timeline. The behavior. All converging in a single space. A single event. The defense countered with absence.
No weapon. No eyewitness.
No direct observation of the act itself. They reminded the jury, certainty requires more than connection. It requires proof beyond doubt. And doubt can exist in silence. The prosecution didn't argue against that. They acknowledged it. Because denying doubt doesn't remove it. But overwhelming it does. So they continued building.
Piece by piece.
Until the structure stood without visible weakness. The suspect remained still. Throughout everything. Listening. Watching. Not reacting. But the stillness wasn't the same as before. It wasn't control anymore. It felt contained. As if everything inside was being held in place by force. Because outside that stillness, the case was closing. The final witnesses approached. The ones who didn't just present evidence but connected it. Investigators who had carried the case across years. Who had seen it when it was silent. And now when it was speaking. They explained the process. The evolution. How a fragment became a lead. How a lead became a suspect. How everything aligned. Not by chance, but by persistence. The defense made their final push.
They returned to time. To the years that had passed.
To the possibility that something, somewhere, had been misinterpreted. That the story, no matter how complete it seemed, still had gaps. And those gaps mattered. Because in those gaps doubt lives. The prosecution didn't deny the gaps. They reframed them. Because no case is perfect. No reconstruction is flawless. But perfection isn't the standard.
Truth is.
And truth, they argued, doesn't require perfection. It requires alignment. And everything in this case aligned. The courtroom settled into its final silence. Not empty. Not uncertain. Just waiting. Because after everything had been said, everything now rested with the jury. The story was complete. The structure built. The silence broken. And now, the question that had lived for years without an answer was no longer unanswered. It was just waiting to be spoken. Out loud. The jury didn't deliberate loudly. There were no raised voices echoing through the room, no visible fractures. No sudden shifts that anyone outside could read. Just a closed door, a long table, and 12 people sitting with the weight of years pressed into paper, evidence, memory. Time moved differently there. Minutes stretched. Hours folded into themselves. Because deliberation isn't about speed, it's about certainty. And certainty, in a case built from fragments, doesn't arrive easily. Inside that room, the case was taken apart. Not emotionally. Not dramatically.
Piece by piece.
The DNA came first. It always does. Because it's the strongest anchor, the point that doesn't move. The profile, the match, the explanation from experts who had stood in that courtroom and explained calmly, precisely, how a fragment preserved for years had finally found its voice. Some jurors saw it as definitive. Others questioned it, not the science, but the context. Presence doesn't equal guilt. That argument lingered. It had been repeated in court, reinforced by the defense, positioned as the central doubt. And doubt, once introduced, doesn't disappear. It has to be addressed.
So they moved to the timeline.
The reconstruction. Where the suspect had been. What they had said. How those statements had shifted over time. One juror pointed out the inconsistencies. Small changes. Subtle. But consistent. Another countered, memory fades. Years change perception. What feels like contradiction might just be time eroding detail. The room didn't settle. It shifted. Back and forth. Because every piece of this case could be viewed from more than one angle. That was its strength. And its vulnerability. Then came the scene itself. The house. The hallway. The stillness. No forced entry. No signs of struggle. Jurors returned to that again and again. Because it didn't feel random. It didn't feel chaotic. It felt controlled. And control implies intention. But intention requires proof. Not assumption. So they examined the possibilities. Could someone else have entered? Could the evidence point in another direction? Could coincidence, no matter how unlikely, still exist? These weren't easy questions. They weren't supposed to be. Because the standard wasn't belief. It was certainty beyond doubt. The fibers. The trace evidence. Discussed next. Explained again, not by experts this time, but by interpretation. What did it mean to find those microscopic links? Were they definitive? Or supportive? Could they exist without direct involvement? The answers weren't unanimous. But the pattern was becoming harder to ignore. Because each piece, on its own, left space. Together that space narrowed. The interrogation footage became a turning point. Not for all, but for enough. They replayed it in memory. The pause. The hesitation. The detail that slipped out. A detail no one had asked for. A detail that hadn't been public. That moment sat heavily in the room. Because it wasn't scientific. It wasn't technical. It was human. And human moments are harder to explain away. One juror questioned it. Pressure can create mistakes. Interrogations can distort behavior. But another responded, pressure doesn't create knowledge. It reveals it. And that distinction mattered. Because the detail wasn't invented. It was revealed. And revelation suggests presence. The discussion circled. Returned to the same points. DNA. Timeline. Behavior.
Scene.
Again and again. Because certainty isn't built once. It's built repeatedly. Until it holds under pressure. Outside the room, the courtroom remained still. Families waited. Investigators sat in silence. The suspect remained composed. But time was no longer neutral. It was moving towards something inevitable. Inside, the jurors began to align. Not completely, but enough. The pieces, when viewed together, formed something that resisted alternative explanation. Not perfectly, but strongly. Strong enough to outweigh doubt. Strong enough to answer the question they had been given. The vote wasn't immediate. It never is. Because once spoken, it can't be taken back. So they reviewed everything again.
Carefully.
Deliberately. Making sure nothing had been overlooked. Because the weight of this decision didn't just belong to the present. It reached back. To that night in 2000. To the silence that followed. To the years without answers. And forward. To what would come after. Finally, the door opened. Not dramatically. Just quietly. But the shift was immediate. Because everyone knew what that meant. The jury returned to their seats. The room filled with a different kind of tension. Not questioning. Not building. Waiting. The verdict was handed over. Folded. Contained. But carrying everything inside it. The judge read it.
Calm.
Measured. The words didn't echo. They didn't need to. Because their impact didn't come from volume. It came from finality.
Guilty.
The word landed without sound. But it changed everything. For the family, it wasn't relief. Not completely. Because nothing returns what was lost. But it was something else. An end to uncertainty. A name attached to a moment that had lived without one. For the investigators, it wasn't victory. It was completion. Years of work. Years of waiting. All converging into a single point. For the suspect, the silence shifted again. No longer protective. No longer controlled. Now it was consequence. The courtroom didn't erupt. It didn't need to. Because the weight of what had just happened didn't require reaction. It required acknowledgement. The case that had once been cold was no longer unresolved. The fragment of DNA that had waited in storage for years had done what it was always meant to do. It had spoken. And when it did, it brought everything with it. The hallway. The stillness. The moment that had remained untouched by time. Now defined. Now understood. Not perfectly. But enough. As the proceedings moved forward, the narrative settled into place. Not as speculation. Not as theory. But as record. A documented sequence of events that could be revisited, examined, understood. The town that had lived with uncertainty now had something else. Not closure. But clarity. And clarity, even when incomplete, changes everything. Because questions lose their power when answers exist. Even imperfect ones. The courtroom emptied slowly. People leaving with their own interpretations. Their own reactions. Because cases like this don't end when the verdict is read. They continue. In memory. In conversation. In the quiet moments where people revisit what they've heard and try to understand what it means. For years, this story had existed without an ending. Now it had one. But endings don't erase beginnings. They redefine them. That night in 2000 and change. The snow still fell. The house still stood in silence. The moment still happened exactly as it did. But now it wasn't alone. It had context. It had connection. It had a truth that had finally caught up with it. And that truth, once spoken, doesn't disappear again. The verdict didn't end the story. It exposed what had always been underneath it. Because justice, when it finally arrives, doesn't erase the past. It sharpens it. It brings every unanswered moment back into focus, not as mystery anymore, but as memory that now carries meaning. The courtroom emptied slowly that day. Not with relief. Not with celebration. But with something quieter. Recognition. Because for years, this case had lived in absence. Absence of answers, absence of direction, absence of closure. Now, that absence had been replaced with something solid. Not perfect, not complete, but real. Outside, the air felt different. The same streets, the same houses, the same town that had carried this weight for decades. But now the silence had changed. It wasn't hiding anything anymore. It had been broken. The victim's name, once tied only to uncertainty, now carried something else: resolution. A narrative that connected her final moments to a truth that had been buried, but not lost. For the family, the shift was complicated. Closure is a word people use easily, but it rarely fits. Because nothing about loss closes. Nothing about absence resolves cleanly. What they had now wasn't an ending. It was an answer. And answers don't remove pain. They define it. They give it edges. They give it shape. For years, they had lived with questions. What happened? Who did this?
Why?
Now, at least one of those questions had been answered. And that answer mattered. Inside the legal system, the case moved forward again. Sentencing. Final statements. The formal conclusion of a process that had taken years to build. The prosecution laid out everything once more. Not to convince, but to record. Because now it wasn't about proving.
It was about documenting.
The timeline. The evidence. The behavior. All of it placed into the official narrative. A permanent structure that would exist beyond memory. Beyond interpretation. The defense made their final arguments. Not to overturn, but to mitigate. To frame the individual not as the sum of a single act, but as something more complex. Because even in cases like this, the story doesn't end with guilt. It continues with consequence. The judge listened.
Calm.
Measured. Because sentencing isn't about emotion. It's about balance. Between what was done and what must follow. When the sentence was delivered, it didn't come as a surprise. But that didn't make it lighter. Because weight doesn't depend on expectation. It depends on impact. And this case carried impact far beyond the courtroom. The suspect, now no longer just a suspect, remained composed. Even then. Even at the end of it.
No visible collapse.
No sudden reaction. Just the same stillness that had defined everything from the beginning. But now that stillness meant something different. It wasn't control anymore. It was containment. Because the narrative that had been held together for years had finally broken. And there was no rebuilding it. After the sentencing, the case entered its final phase. Not investigation. Not prosecution. But reflection. Files were archived. Evidence cataloged for the last time. Reports finalized. Everything placed into its permanent position. A case that had once been active, uncertain, unresolved now became record. But record doesn't mean forgotten. Because some cases don't fade. They remain. Not because of their complexity, but because of what they reveal. This one revealed time. How it can hide truth. Preserve it. Protect it until the moment comes when it can no longer remain buried. It revealed technology. How something once invisible can become undeniable. How a fragment can grow into a voice. It revealed behavior. Control. silence. The ability for someone to exist within normalcy while carrying something hidden beneath it. And most of all, it revealed patience. Because this case didn't break open quickly. It didn't collapse under pressure. It waited. Years. Decades. Until every piece aligned. Back in the town, life continued. It always does. But not unchanged. People remembered. Not constantly. Not every day. But in moments. In passing thoughts. In quiet reflections. Because the story had been part of the place for too long to simply disappear. Now it existed differently. Not as a question. But as a fact. Something that could be understood. Even if it couldn't be undone. For investigators, the case left something behind. Not just experience. But perspective. Because cases like this don't just test skill. They test endurance. The ability to keep going when there's nothing new. To revisit what's already been seen. To believe that something small, something overlooked, can change everything. And in this case it did. A fragment of DNA. Left behind in a moment that was meant to leave nothing.
Stored. Ignored.
Revisited. Until it became the key to everything. That detail stayed with them. Because it changed how they looked at every other case. Every other fragment. Every other silence. Because silence, they knew now, doesn't mean absence. It means waiting. The final reports were filed. The case officially closed. But the story didn't end there. It moved outward. Into conversations. Into memory. Into the quiet space where people try to understand how something like this can happen. And what it means when it does. Because understanding isn't just about facts. It's about meaning. And meaning, in cases like this, is never simple. Why that night? Why that house? Why her? Those questions remain. Even when everything else has been answered. Because truth doesn't always come with explanation. Sometimes it just comes. Complete in one way. Incomplete in another. And that's what lingers. Not the evidence. Not the trial. But the space between what is known and what never will be. The house still stands. The street still exists. The snow still falls in winter, covering everything in the same quiet way it did that night. But now, beneath that silence, there's something else. Not hidden. Not buried. But remembered. A moment that once disappeared into the dark, now part of something permanent. Something understood. Because the truth, once it surfaces, doesn't go back. It stays. In records. In memory. In the quiet understanding that even the smallest fragment can carry everything needed to break years of silence. And sometimes that's all it takes. The case was officially closed. At least, that was what the paperwork said.
Closed.
A word stamped onto a file after years of unanswered questions, endless interviews, laboratory reports, courtroom arguments, and nights when investigators wondered whether the truth would ever surface. But outside the courthouse, the word felt strangely incomplete. Because a verdict can close a case. It cannot close a memory. And in this Minnesota community, memory had become part of the landscape. For years, people had driven past the same streets without saying much. They had walked past houses beneath winter skies. They had watched snow cover sidewalks and rooftops, just as it had on the night everything changed. Now they knew who had been responsible. But knowing did not make that night disappear. It made people remember it more clearly. The first reaction came from the community itself. Shock. Then disbelief. Then the questions. How had someone lived normally for so long? How had investigators missed the connection in 2000? How could a tiny biological trace survive while everything else, the witnesses, the memories, the assumptions, slowly disappeared? The answer was painfully simple. Time had changed everything, except the evidence. That was the strange power of the case. People forgot. Technology improved. Departments changed. Investigators retired. Files moved from shelves to storage rooms. But that microscopic trace remained exactly where it had been placed. Waiting. For years, it meant almost nothing. Then science changed. And suddenly it meant everything. The breakthrough became a lesson inside law enforcement circles. Cold cases were no longer necessarily dead cases. Evidence collected decades earlier could become valuable again when technology advanced. A sample that once produced only a partial profile could eventually identify a person. A fingerprint too damaged for one generation of investigators might become readable to another. A photograph that seemed insignificant might reveal a detail through modern enhancement. Time could bury a crime. But time could also strengthen the tools used to uncover it. That realization changed how investigators viewed old files. Across offices and evidence rooms, forgotten cases began receiving new attention. Boxes were opened. Evidence inventories reviewed. Old biological samples located. Cases that had been considered hopeless were examined again. Not because investigators suddenly knew the answers. Because they knew something different now. They knew that yesterday's limitations were not necessarily tomorrow's limitations. And that distinction mattered. For the investigators who had worked this Minnesota case, however, the experience was personal. They had seen the file when it was nothing but questions. They had watched promising leads collapse. They had listened to family members ask the same question year after year. Who did this? Why did it happen? Would we ever know? Those questions had no answers for a long time. Then the DNA changed the conversation. Suddenly, the impossible became possible. The person responsible was no longer an unknown figure hiding behind an empty silhouette. There was a name. A face. A history. A life that had continued while another life had ended. That contrast was difficult to process. The suspect had gone to work, bought groceries, spoken to people,
celebrat a ordinar i moments,
passed through years without being stopped by the crime that had haunted everyone else. That is one of the most disturbing realities of a cold case. The world moves forward, even when justice does not. Children grow up. Buildings change. Businesses close. New families move into neighborhoods. People who were teenagers become grandparents. And somewhere inside all that ordinary life, an unanswered murder remains frozen in time. The victim does not age. The crime does not change. Only the people remembering it do. That was why the resolution mattered. It restored a piece of time. Not the life that was lost. That could never be restored. But the truth surrounding it. For the victim's family, there was now a permanent record. A record that said this was not a mystery without an ending. It happened. Someone was responsible. Evidence survived. Investigators continued. And eventually, the truth reached the courtroom. But even after the conviction, one question refused to disappear.
Why?
Why did the suspect do it? Why that night? Why that victim? Those questions were harder. Evidence can identify. Science can connect. Courts can determine guilt. But motive lives somewhere else. Sometimes it can be reconstructed. Sometimes it remains locked inside the mind of the person who committed the crime. And in this case, even with the DNA match and the conviction, parts of the story remain dark. There were moments investigators could explain. There were moments they could only infer. And there were moments that would probably never be understood. That uncertainty became part of the case's final shape. Not every mystery disappears when an arrest is made. Some mysteries simply become smaller. The biggest question had been answered. Who? But why remained? And perhaps that was the most haunting part. Because the family had spent years imagining possibilities. A stranger. An enemy. Someone passing through. Someone they had never known. Now the answer had a face. And sometimes a face is harder to accept than a mystery. A mystery allows the mind to imagine anything. A person makes the truth real. The case also forced investigators to revisit the original investigation. What had been missed? What assumptions had shaped the early inquiry? Which decisions made sense with the information available at the time? Which should have been questioned? There was no simple answer. Hindsight is dangerous. Investigators in 2000 did not have the technology available decades later. They did not have the databases. They did not have the forensic tools. They did not have the same ability to process tiny amounts of DNA. They worked with what they had. And sometimes what they had was not enough. That distinction mattered. Because solving a cold case is not always about discovering that investigators failed. Sometimes it is about discovering that science finally caught up. The case became a reminder of that. The smallest clue can survive the longest. A drop. A fiber. A print. A fragment. Something invisible to the naked eye. Something ordinary. Something no one notices. Until years later, when someone asks the right question. What if we test it again? That question can change everything. For the people who lived near the crime scene, the resolution created another strange feeling. Relief mixed with discomfort. They had spent years wondering whether the person responsible could still be nearby. Now they knew. The fear had a name. But knowing that name did not erase the years when nobody knew. People remembered how cautious they had become. How doors were locked. How strangers were watched. How ordinary noises at night could suddenly sound threatening. That fear had shaped behavior long after the original headlines disappeared. Now it had somewhere to go. Not away, but somewhere. The community could finally place the event in the past. That is what a solved cold case gives a town. Not forgetting. Permission to stop wondering. And there is a difference. Wondering consumes energy. It keeps old questions alive. It turns anniversaries into investigations. It makes every unanswered detail feel like a warning. Resolution does not remove the memory. It removes the uncertainty surrounding it. Years after the crime, the street could finally become just a street again. The house could become just a house. Winter could become winter. Snow could fall without carrying the same meaning. But for those closest to the victim, there would always be one date. One night. One moment when everything changed. And perhaps that was the final lesson of the Minnesota 2000 cold case. Justice does not always arrive quickly. Sometimes it arrives after the detectives who began the investigation are gone. Sometimes it arrives after technology has transformed the evidence. Sometimes it arrives when almost everyone has stopped expecting it. But evidence can wait. A cold case can sleep for years without truly disappearing. And when the right technology meets the right evidence, the past can suddenly become present again. That was what happened here. The DNA did not speak in 2000. It could not. But it was there.
Quiet.
Invisible. Patient. Waiting for someone decades later to ask the question that investigators could not answer before. Whose DNA is this? The answer changed everything. It transformed a nameless mystery into a prosecution, a forgotten file into a courtroom, a decades-old question into a verdict, and a community's fear into something closer to peace. But there was still one final truth. The victim never got to see the answer. She never heard the verdict, never watched investigators walk into court carrying the evidence that would finally explain what happened. The justice came later, much later, for everyone except the person who needed it most. And that is why cold cases are never simply stories about criminals being caught.
They're stories about time.
About people who refuse to stop looking. About families who continue waiting. About evidence that survives when memories fail. About a truth that can disappear from headlines without disappearing from reality. The snow that fell that night in Minnesota eventually melted. The footprints disappeared. The roads cleared. Spring came. Then summer. Then another winter. 20 years could pass.
More.
But beneath all those seasons, the evidence remained. And eventually, the silence broke. Not with a scream. Not with a dramatic confession. With a laboratory result.
A match.
A name. And the realization that the past had never really been gone. It had simply been waiting. And now, after all those years, the question that once haunted Minnesota finally had an answer. But the answer did not feel like the end. It felt like the moment the darkness finally had a shape. And once darkness has a shape, you can finally see where it came from. There are some nights a community remembers forever. Not because the night itself was extraordinary, because of what came after. For Minnesota, the winter night in 2000 became one of those memories. A night that began quietly. A night that looked ordinary from the outside. A night no one expected to become the beginning of a decades-long search for the truth. Years later, the case had finally reached its final page. The verdict had been delivered. The evidence had been examined. The DNA had spoken. The courtroom had heard the story. And the person responsible was no longer hidden behind an unanswered question. But when the investigators returned to the old case file, they found something unsettling. The photographs looked exactly the same. The reports were still there. The handwritten notes had not changed. The evidence labels remained attached to the same containers. Everything that had seemed frozen in time was still frozen. Only the world around it had changed. That was the strange power of a cold case. It could remain untouched while generations moved forward. A detective who once stood at the crime scene might retire. A witness might grow old. A child who remembered the headlines might become an adult with children of their own. The town itself could change completely. But the file waited. And when investigators finally solved it, they realized that the case had never truly disappeared. It had been waiting for the right moment, the right technology, the right connection, the right person willing to look again. That persistence became the final story behind the story. Because solving a cold case is rarely one brilliant discovery. It is usually hundreds of small decisions. A detective deciding not to discard an old piece of evidence. A technician choosing to run another test. An investigator noticing a name that had been overlooked. A prosecutor asking one more question. A family member refusing to let the victim become only a photograph in an archive. Each decision seems small. Until one day they connect. And when they connect, decades can collapse in an instant. That was what the DNA match represented. Not just science. Persistence. A tiny biological trace had survived longer than memories. It survived changing technology. It survived personnel changes. It survived the passage of time. And when investigators finally had the tools to understand it, that fragment became the bridge between 2000 and the present. The bridge was narrow, but it was strong enough. Strong enough to carry the case across decades. Strong enough to bring an unknown person into focus. Strong enough to transform suspicion into evidence. And strong enough to give a grieving family something they had not had for years. An answer. Not every answer, but the most important one. Who was responsible? That question had once dominated every conversation surrounding the case. Now it had been replaced by something different. What can we learn from what happened? That question was harder. Because the truth was not comparable. The person responsible had not been some mythical figure appearing from nowhere. They had existed within ordinary life. They had moved through the same world as everyone else. They had been seen.
Spoken to.
Perhaps trusted. That reality was one of the most disturbing elements of the entire case. Danger does not always announce itself. Sometimes it looks ordinary. Sometimes it blends perfectly into the background. Sometimes the person capable of doing something terrible can continue living a life that appears completely normal. That is why the original investigators struggled. They were searching for someone who looked like a killer. But there may be no such face. There may be no obvious sign. No warning written across someone's forehead. No expression that tells the world what they are capable of. Only evidence can establish what happened. And in this case, the evidence took years to become readable. The final investigation also changed the way people thought about DNA. For years, forensic science had seemed almost magical. A tiny trace could identify someone. But the reality was more complicated. DNA is not a time machine. It cannot tell investigators everything. It cannot automatically explain motive. It cannot recreate every second of a crime. What it can do is connect people, places, and evidence. And sometimes, that connection is enough to reopen a door that everyone believed had been permanently closed. The Minnesota case demonstrated that power. The sample had existed long before the technology could fully use it. That distinction matters. The evidence was not suddenly created when the case was solved. It had always been there. The truth had always been there. Only the ability to see it had changed. That realization stayed with the investigators. Because somewhere else, perhaps in another evidence room, another cold case could be waiting. Another box. Another envelope. Another fragment. Another answer hidden inside something everyone had already examined. That possibility gave the case a life beyond its own conclusion. It became a reminder. Never assume an old case is truly finished simply because today's technology cannot solve it. Never assume a small piece of evidence is meaningless because it cannot answer a question immediately. And never assume time has erased everything. Sometimes time preserves exactly what you need. The family understood that better than anyone. For years, they had lived with an absence that could not be explained. Birthdays came and went. Holidays passed. Photographs aged.
People changed.
But one question remained exactly the same. What happened? Now they knew. The knowledge did not bring the victim back. It did not restore the years stolen from them. It did not erase grief. But it gave the grief somewhere to rest. There is a difference between mourning someone whose death is understood and mourning someone whose death remains a mystery. Mystery keeps the mind searching. Every possibility remains open. Every theory can return. Every new phone call can create hope. Every silence can create fear. Resolution closes those doors. Not all of them, but enough. And sometimes, enough is what a family needs to begin living without the question dominating every quiet moment. The town changed too. The headlines faded. The cameras disappeared. The courthouse returned to normal. People went back to work. Children went to school. Traffic moved through familiar streets. Winter came again. Snow covered the ground. But this time, the snow did not carry the same mystery. The night of 2000 had been given an ending. Not a happy ending. There are no happy endings in murder cases. But a truthful one. And truth matters. Especially when it arrives late. Perhaps that is why cold cases remain so powerful. They remind us that justice does not always operate on the schedule people want. Sometimes justice is slow. Sometimes painfully slow. Sometimes it arrives after years of disappointment. But slow does not necessarily mean impossible. A case can sit dormant for years and still contain everything needed to solve it. One piece of evidence. One forgotten detail. One technological breakthrough. One investigator who refuses to stop asking questions. That can be enough. The most haunting image from this case is not the courtroom. It is not the arrest. It is not even the DNA report. It is the evidence sitting quietly for years. A tiny fragment sealed away. No voice. No movement.
No explanation.
Just waiting. Waiting while the world changed around it. Waiting while investigators moved on to other cases. Waiting while the family lived with uncertainty. Waiting until science finally caught up. Then suddenly the fragment became a name. And the name became an investigation. The investigation became an arrest. The arrest became a trial. And the trial became a verdict. That chain of events stretched across years, but every link depended on the one before it. Remove the DNA, and the investigation might never have reopened. Remove the persistence, and the DNA might never have been tested again. Remove the family's refusal to forget, and the case might have become just another file in storage. Nothing happened in isolation. Everything connected. That is what makes the endings so powerful. The killer did not disappear into history. The evidence did not disappear with the victim. The truth did not disappear when the case went cold. It waited. And eventually it surfaced. There will always be unanswered questions. There will always be details that remain uncertain. There will always be parts of that night that no courtroom can completely reconstruct. But the central mystery is no longer a mystery. The name is known. The evidence has been heard. The verdict has been recorded. And the case that once seemed destined to remain unresolved has become something else entirely. A warning. A reminder. A lesson written in forensic evidence and years of persistence. Cold cases are not always dead. Sometimes they are sleeping. Sometimes the answer is already sitting inside an evidence room. Sometimes the smallest clue is carrying the entire story. And sometimes, decades after a crime has vanished from the front pages, science can bring it back. That is what happened here. The snow fell. The footprints disappeared. The seasons changed. The years passed. But one thing remained. Evidence.
Quiet.
Invisible. Patient. Waiting for the day someone would finally understand what it was saying. And when that day came, the silence that had surrounded the Minnesota case for so long finally broke. Not with a dramatic confession. Not with a stranger appearing at the police station. Not with some impossible twist.
It broke with science.
With persistence. With a DNA match that stunned investigators and changed the meaning of an entire case. For years, the question had been simple. Who did it? Now, the question has become something else. How many other answers are still waiting? How many forgotten evidence boxes contain fragments that today's technology could finally understand? How many families are still staring at photographs, still waiting for a phone call, still wondering whether someone will look again? The Minnesota case offers no promise that every mystery will be solved. But it offers something more realistic.
Hope.
hope that evidence can survive, a hope that technology can improve, hope that someone will keep searching, and hope that even after years of silence, the truth can still find a way out. The house may become quiet again. The street may forget the headlines. The courtroom may empty. The investigators may eventually retire. But the case will remain. Not as an unsolved mystery anymore. As a reminder of what time can hide and what time cannot erase. Because the most frightening thing about a cold case is not that the truth is gone. It is that the truth may be sitting somewhere in the darkness. Waiting. Waiting for science. Waiting for persistence. Waiting for one more test. One more question. One more person willing to open the file. And when that happens, decades can collapse in a single moment. A fragment can become a name. A name can become an arrest. An arrest can become justice. And a case once buried beneath 20 years of silence can finally speak. That is where this story ends. Not with the snow. Not with the darkness. But with the evidence that survived both. The truth was never gone. It was only waiting for someone to find it.